My family mocked my Army nurse grandma's poverty. Her $12 million trust changed everything. They'd always treated Grandma Eleanor like some sort of charity case, a relic from a forgotten era. Her worn-out cardigan, the chipped ceramic teacups she insisted on using, the way her hands, gnarled from years of scrubbing floors and tending to the wounded, would tremble slightly when she reached for her prune juice. These were the things my mother and her sisters, my aunts Carol and Susan, would whisper about behind cupped hands at family gatherings, their perfectly manicured nails clicking against crystal wine glasses. I was maybe 10 or 11 the first time I heard it, a hushed conversation at Thanksgiving dinner, the air thick with the scent of roasted turkey and passive aggression. "Honestly, Mom," Aunt Carol had sighed, her voice dripping with a manufactured pity that made my stomach clench. "It's just embarrassing, the way she lives. You'd think after all these years, she'd have something more to show for it." My mother had just nodded, a tight, pursed-lipped agreement that said more than words. Grandma Eleanor, sitting at the head of the table, her gentle smile unwavering, seemed oblivious, or perhaps just chosen to be. She'd served in World War II, a nurse in the Pacific Theater, stories she rarely shared, accounts of mud, blood, and the sheer, raw resilience of the human spirit. We saw her for holidays, the dutiful obligation, the annual pilgrimage to her modest bungalow in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood that time seemed to have forgotten. Her house was clean, immaculately so, but filled with the ghosts of a simpler, harder existence. Hand-me-down furniture, threadbare rugs, and a prevailing scent of lavender potpourri that masked a faint undercurrent of mothballs. My cousins, pampered and spoiled, would make crude jokes about her thriftiness, her carefully rationed portions of dessert, her refusal to ever splurge on anything beyond the absolute necessities. They called her Grandma Pennypinch and the Queen of Freebies, their laughter echoing in the sterile modernity of my parents' sprawling suburban estate, a stark contrast to Eleanor's humble abode. I, on the other hand, had always felt a strange pull towards her. Maybe it was the quiet strength I saw in her eyes, a depth that eluded the superficial chatter of the rest of the family. Maybe it was the way she'd sometimes share small, almost forgotten details of her life, a fleeting mention of a dance under the Hawaiian moonlight, the sheer terror of a bombing raid, the comforting weight of a soldier's hand in hers as she tried to soothe his pain. These weren't tales of glamour or fame, but of profound human connection and survival. My own life, by comparison, felt soft, sheltered. I was on track to follow in my mother's footsteps, a path laid out with the polished stones of privilege, private schools, prestigious universities, a well-connected husband, and a future cushioned by inherited wealth. My father was a prominent lawyer, my mother a socialite who curated their lives with the same meticulous care she applied to her rose garden. Family dinners were elaborate affairs, a performance of polished civility. But beneath the surface, a current of competition and judgment always flowed, particularly directed towards Eleanor. She was the outlier, the reminder of a life lived without the easy abundance they took for granted. The annual summer vacation was always at my parents' lake house, a sprawling estate with enough bedrooms to house a small army. This year, though, was different. My Uncle Robert, my father's younger brother, had recently passed away, leaving behind a gaping hole in the family fabric, and more significantly, a substantial estate. Uncle Robert had been the black sheep, the one who'd always chased grand, often failed business ventures, but somehow he'd managed to stumble into a lucrative deal right before his death, leaving behind a fortune that was now the subject of intense family speculation. The will reading was scheduled for the first day of our vacation, a somber prelude to what I suspected would be anything but a somber affair. We gathered in the formal living room, the air thick with the scent of expensive wood polish and unspoken anxieties. My mother, dressed in a pristine white pantsuit, sat beside my father, their faces etched with a mixture of grief and anticipation. Aunt Carol and Aunt Susan were already comparing notes, their voices low and urgent, speculating on beneficiaries, percentages, the distribution of assets. And then there was Grandma Eleanor, sitting quietly in a corner armchair, a faded floral dress softening her sharp, angular features. She looked smaller, more fragile than ever, a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. The lawyer, a stern man named Mr. Davies, cleared his throat. As you all know, Robert's affairs were complex. However, his final will is quite clear. He unrolled a thick document, his voice droning through legalese. My parents and aunts leaned forward, their expressions rapt. He read out various bequests, sentimental items to distant cousins, donations to obscure charities. Then came the part that mattered. To my dear sister, Eleanor Hayes. My mother's eyes flickered with what looked like a flicker of sympathy, quickly masked. Aunt Carol adjusted her pearls. I leave the sum of $10 million. Silence. A profound, suffocating silence that hung heavier than any oppressive summer heat. It wasn't just surprise, it was disbelief, a complete shattering of their carefully constructed reality. My mother's mouth fell open, her carefully applied makeup suddenly looking stark and wrong. Aunt Carol let out a small, choked gasp, her hand flying to her throat. Aunt Susan, usually the most composed, looked as if she'd been physically struck. Their hushed whispers, their patronizing pity, their dismissive attitudes towards Eleanor's perceived poverty, all of it evaporated in that single, stunning declaration. $10 million. My grandmother, the woman they deemed a financial failure, a burden, a source of embarrassment. Suddenly, the carefully curated politeness of the room imploded. My mother found her voice first, a high-pitched, almost hysterical squeak. 10 million? Robert, you must be mistaken. Are you sure that's right? $10 million to her? She gestured vaguely towards Eleanor, as if the very concept was an affront to the natural order of things. Aunt Carol, recovering slightly, chimed in, her voice laced with a venom that belied the initial shock. Robert always was impulsive. Clearly, he wasn't thinking straight. This must be a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. Aunt Susan, ever the pragmatist, though her face was pale and drawn, managed to find a sliver of composure. Perhaps there's a clause, a condition. Robert wouldn't have just given that away without reason. Her eyes darted towards Eleanor, a new, unfamiliar glint of suspicion in them. Grandma Eleanor, who had remained perfectly still throughout this onslaught, finally stirred. She didn't look surprised, not exactly. There was a quiet strength in her gaze that I'd always recognized, a steely resolve that had likely seen her through much worse than this. She met her daughter's horrified stares with a calm that was more potent than any defense. Robert understood, she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying across the suddenly silent room. He understood more than any of you ever did. My father, bless his usually level head, looked bewildered. He exchanged a glance with my mother, his brow furrowed. He'd always been more pragmatic, less prone to the emotional theatrics of his wife and her sisters, but even he seemed taken aback by the sheer magnitude of the inheritance and the immediate backlash. Eleanor, he said, trying to inject a note of reason, this is unexpected. Robert never mentioned anything like this. That's because he knew you'd all react exactly like this, Eleanor replied, her gaze sweeping across her daughters, a hint of sadness now coloring her tone. He knew you'd see it as a windfall, something to be squabbled over. He wanted to ensure I had security, and that my legacy would be remembered, not mocked. The word legacy hung in the air, a foreign concept to them when applied to Eleanor. They saw money as a tool for acquisition, for status, for outward appearances. They didn't grasp that a legacy could be built on something as simple, as profound, as a life lived with integrity and quiet service. The will reading dissolved into a chaotic scene of accusations and disbelief. My mother was near tears, convinced Robert had been manipulated. Aunt Carol was already consulting her own lawyer on her phone, muttering about undue influence. Aunt Susan, though still visibly shaken, was trying to salvage some semblance of control, demanding to see the will again, looking for loopholes. Through it all, Grandma Eleanor remained a figure of quiet dignity. She accepted their outrage with a grace that was almost infuriating to them. As the others descended into a flurry of recriminations, she looked at me, a faint, knowing smile gracing her lips. It was a smile that acknowledged the absurdity of the situation, a smile that held a secret, a promise of something more. Later that evening, after the lawyers had departed and the initial tempest had subsided into a tense, simmering resentment, I found myself drawn to Grandma Eleanor's bungalow. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across her familiar front porch. She was sitting in her usual rocking chair, a cup of chamomile tea in her hands. The house still smelled of lavender and thyme, but tonight it felt different. There was a quiet hum of power in the air, a subtle shift in the energy of the place. "They're in shock, aren't they?" I said,
sitting on the worn porch swing, its chains creaking softly. Eleanor took a slow sip of her tea. They expected Robert's money to be theirs, or at least to be distributed according to their predetermined notions of who deserved what. They never once considered that Robert might have had a different plan, a plan that involved, well, me. But $10 million, I repeated, still trying to wrap my head around it. Where did it? How? She set her teacup down on the small, unsteady table beside her. Her eyes, the color of faded denim, met mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something beyond gentle resignation. It was a spark, a glint of steel that I hadn't noticed before. Robert and I had conversations over the years, she said, her voice low and measured. He knew how my daughters treated me. He saw the way they dismissed my life, my contributions. He understood the quiet sacrifices I made, the years I spent tending to others while they were busy tending to their own social calendars. She paused. Her gaze drifted towards the distant glow of streetlights beginning to pierce the twilight. He didn't just leave me money, sweetheart. He left me a means to ensure that the values I hold dear, the quiet dignity I've tried to live by, are respected. And perhaps, she added, a subtle shift in her tone, a hint of something I couldn't quite decipher, a means to make them understand. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach, not from fear, but from a nascent understanding. This wasn't just an inheritance, it was a weapon, and Grandma Eleanor, the woman they'd mocked and dismissed, was about to wield it.
I looked at her, her frail frame silhouetted against the darkening sky, and saw not the impoverished, neglected matriarch they'd always seen, but a woman armed with a quiet, devastating power. The silence that had fallen over the family estate was about to be replaced by something far more profound, something that would ripple through generations. And I had a feeling that the real story, the one that would truly change everything, was just beginning. The air, once thick with the scent of lavender, now carried a faint, almost imperceptible aroma of something sharp, something potent, like the faintest hint of gunpowder. The next few days were a masterclass in strained politeness and simmering hostility. The family vacation at the lake house devolved into a series of awkward dinners and forced conversations, punctuated by sharp, pointed remarks aimed at Grandma Eleanor, always just below the surface of polite discourse. My mother, in particular, seemed to operate on a perpetual state of barely suppressed outrage. She'd catch my eye across the impeccably set dining table, her gaze a silent plea for validation, a desperate attempt to have me join her in condemning Eleanor's undeserved windfall. But I couldn't. The more they sneered, the more I felt a strange protective warmth bloom in my chest for Eleanor. Aunt Carol and Aunt Susan, meanwhile, had quickly shifted tactics from outright disbelief to a more calculated approach. They circled Eleanor like vultures, offering their unsolicited advice on managing her newfound wealth. "You'll need a good financial advisor, Eleanor," Carol would say, her voice dripping with faux concern. "Someone who understands the complexities of large sums. My firm handles accounts like this all the time, of course. We could introduce you." Susan, ever the strategist, would chime in, "And investments, darling. You can't just let that money sit there. It needs to be working for you. Robert would have wanted it to grow." Their attempts to insinuate themselves into Eleanor's financial life were blatant, transparently driven by greed. They saw her $10 million not as a legacy, but as a playground for their own financial ambitions, a piggy bank waiting to be cracked open. Eleanor, however, remained unyielding. She'd listen patiently, her hands clasped calmly in her lap, offering polite but firm refusals. "Thank you, Carol. I'm sure I'll figure it out." Or, "Susan, I appreciate the thought, but I'm not looking to rush into anything." Her calm was an irritant, a constant reminder that their influence was slipping away, that their ingrained sense of entitlement was being challenged. One afternoon, I found Eleanor in her small, sun-drenched study, a room crammed with bookshelves overflowing with well-worn novels and history texts. She wasn't looking at stock market reports or financial magazines. Instead, she was poring over a thick, leather-bound ledger, her brow furrowed in concentration.
It looked ancient, the pages yellowed and brittle. "What's that, Grandma?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up, her eyes twinkling slightly. "This, my dear, is Robert's accounting. He kept meticulous records of everything, his businesses, his investments, his personal projects." "Personal projects?" She tapped a finger on a page filled with dense columns of numbers and cryptic notes. "Robert was always more than just a businessman, you know. He had diverse interests, and he believed in planting seeds for the future in ways most people never understood." She turned a page, revealing a section with headings that were unfamiliar to me. Community Outreach Fund, Seed Capital, Veteran Support Initiative, Endowment, Historical Preservation Society, Grants. My breath hitched. These weren't the typical ventures of a man chasing quick profits. These looked altruistic. And then I saw it. A recurring entry, dating back years, meticulously documented. E.H. Educational Trust, Annual Contribution. E.H.? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Eleanor smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine. Eleanor Hayes, my love. My own little educational trust. Robert started it for me years ago. He saw my desire to help young nurses, to provide them with opportunities that I never had. He believed in investing in people, in their potential, not just in stocks and bonds. The pieces began to click into place with a terrifying clarity. This wasn't just about Robert's will. This was about Robert's legacy, a legacy built on quiet generosity, on foresight, on a deep understanding of his sister's character and her unspoken desires. He gave you money all this time? I stammered, the scale of it dawning on me. For this trust? Not just money, she corrected gently. He gave me the means to manage it, to grow it, to make strategic decisions. He had absolute faith in my judgment, in my ability to discern genuine need from frivolous desire. He saw that I had a keen eye for potential, for individuals who, with a little help, could achieve great things. She gestured to another section of the ledger. He even set up discrete channels for me to funnel funds into specific projects, anonymously. He didn't want recognition. He wanted impact. The true depth of the betrayal, the sheer magnitude of their ignorance, hit me like a physical blow. My mother, my aunts, they saw Grandma Eleanor as a penniless old woman, a charity case. They'd reveled in her perceived poverty, using it as a benchmark to highlight their own success. And all the while, she had been a silent architect, a benefactor, a force for good, quietly empowered by a brother who understood and valued her in ways her own daughters never could. So, that $10 million is simply an acceleration, Eleanor finished, her voice firm.
A way to ensure that the work we've been doing, the impact we've been making, can continue and expand exponentially. Robert wanted to make sure I had the resources to truly make a difference, without any interference from those who would only see it as a personal gain. I stared at her, my mind reeling. The worn cardigan, the chipped teacups, they were a deliberate facade, a shield. She had lived frugally not out of necessity, but out of principle, out of a desire to maximize the impact of the resources Robert had entrusted to her. She had seen their judgment, their scorn, and had chosen silence, choosing instead to nurture her own quiet power. "They think you're just rich now," I said, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "They think this is their chance to finally get their hands on something they believe they deserve." Eleanor's gaze was steady, unwavering. "And they will try, of course. They always do. But they don't understand the foundation Robert built. They don't understand that this isn't just money. It's a system, a network of support, and I am its steward." She closed the ledger with a soft thud. Robert's will wasn't a gift, my dear. It was an affirmation, an empowerment. The atmosphere in the lake house crackled with unspoken tension. My mother and aunts, sensing a shift they couldn't quite articulate, redoubled their efforts to charm and cajole Eleanor. They invited her for boat rides, for bridge games, for lengthy brunches where the conversation always, inevitably, circled back to financial planning and future security.
They were trying to lull her into a false sense of complacency, to make her believe that their facade of sisterly concern was genuine. But Valinor was no longer the passive recipient of their thinly veiled condescension. There was a new resolve in her eyes, a quiet confidence that unnerved them. She listened politely, answered their questions vaguely, and always steered the conversation back to them, subtly probing their own financial situations, their own past decisions. She was gathering intelligence, I realized, observing their vulnerabilities. One evening, during a particularly excruciating dinner where Aunt Susan was regaling everyone with tales of her son's exorbitant college tuition, Eleanor cleared her throat softly. "Susan, dear," she began, her voice gentle, "I was looking through Robert's records. He mentioned a rather significant investment he made in Global Innovations Group a few years back. Sounded like a very promising venture, he said. He was quite enthusiastic about its potential for long-term growth. Did you ever have any dealings with them?" Susan froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. Her usually rosy cheeks paled. "Global Innovations? I don't recall that name specifically." Her eyes darted nervously to my mother. Aunt Carol, sensing the shift in Susan's demeanor, interjected smoothly. "Robert was always investing in so many things, Eleanor. It's hard to keep track."
Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on Susan. "Oh, but he was quite specific about this one. He even mentioned that you, Susan, had expressed interest in it. Said you'd advised him on the initial strategy, if I remember correctly. He seemed quite grateful for your input." Susan swallowed hard, her eyes wide with panic. That's not entirely accurate, Eleanor. Robert's decisions were his own. I merely offered a few casual observations. Casual observations that apparently led to a substantial initial investment, from the looks of it," Eleanor continued, her tone still mild, almost conversational, but with an edge that was impossible to ignore. "It's fascinating, really, because according to Robert's records, that casual observation of yours seems to have directly coincided with a rather significant influx of personal funds into your own accounts shortly thereafter, almost as if you were compensated for your expert advice, wouldn't you say?" The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's jaw dropped. Carol stared at Susan, her eyes narrowed in disbelief and nascent fury. Susan, cornered and exposed, looked utterly devastated, her carefully constructed facade crumbling around her. That's a lie," Susan stammered, her voice cracking. "Robert was a generous man, but he wouldn't have involved me in anything so clandestine." "Clandestine?" Eleanor repeated, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. "Or perhaps discreet. Robert valued discretion, and he also valued honesty. He felt it was important that his sister be aware of certain business practices, especially when those practices involved funds that he had earmarked for other purposes." She paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the air. Then her gaze shifted, sweeping across my mother and Aunt Carol. "You see," she said, her voice now carrying a new weight, a quiet authority that silenced all other thoughts. "Robert didn't just leave me money. He left me his books, his entire financial history. And it turns out, he was a man who liked to keep a very close eye on where his money was going and who was benefiting from it, directly or indirectly. He had a particular interest in ensuring that his sister's well-being was never compromised by the more opportunistic tendencies of others." My mother finally found her voice, a strangled whisper. What are you saying, Eleanor?" Eleanor's gaze softened, but the steel was still there, sharper than ever. "I'm saying, dear sister, that Robert's generosity wasn't just a personal gift. It was a calculated investment, an investment in integrity. And he made sure that I had the means to protect that investment." She looked directly at Susan, her eyes holding a depth of knowing that was both ancient and terrifying. "He wanted to ensure that those who profited from his good nature, at my expense, would eventually face the consequences, and he trusted me to be the one to deliver them." The air was thick with shock. Susan's face was ashen, her body trembling. Aunt Carol looked as if she'd seen a ghost. My mother simply stared, her eyes wide with a dawning horror, a terrifying realization beginning to creep into her expression. The carefully crafted image of Eleanor as the frail, impoverished relative had shattered. In its place stood a woman of quiet power, armed with an arsenal of financial truths. The game had changed, irrevocably, and the hunters had just realized they were now the prey. Eleanor's calm had turned into a chilling, calculated composure. The scent of gunpowder in the air was no longer a faint suggestion. It was a palpable, suffocating reality. The silence that followed wasn't just a pause in conversation. It was the deep, resonant hum of a dam about to break. The silence that descended was a physical entity, pressing down on us, each exhale a fragile sound against its immense weight. Susan sat frozen, a statue carved from guilt and terror, her eyes fixed on some point in the distance, somewhere far beyond the ornate dining room where the remnants of a forced meal lay scattered. My mother's face was a roadmap of disbelief, her usual indignant flush replaced by a stark, ashen pallor. Aunt Carol, who always had an answer, an excuse, a deflection, was utterly devoid of them, her jaw slack, her eyes darting between Eleanor and Susan, as if trying to reconcile two irreconcilable realities. Eleanor's gaze remained steady, a serene calm emanating from her that felt more powerful than any shout. It wasn't the calm of innocence, but the deep, settled composure of someone who had prepared for this moment for years, someone who had played the long game and was now collecting on a debt that had been accumulating silently, meticulously for decades. The $10 million wasn't a windfall for her. It was the keys to the vault, the validation of a lifetime of quiet stewardship. It was the weapon she had been quietly sharpening while they were busy sharpening their knives for each other. Robert was a very thorough man, Eleanor said, her voice still soft but carrying an unnerving finality. She looked at Susan, a hint of something that might have been regret, or perhaps just a clinical observation in her eyes. He understood the dynamics of family. He saw how certain tendencies could manifest. He wanted to ensure that his sister, his only sister, was protected from them, and he believed in consequences. My mother finally stirred, her voice a rough, choked sound. Consequences? Eleanor, what are you talking about? Susan made a mistake. Robert was generous. He wouldn't hold that over her, not like this. Eleanor turned her gaze to my mother, and for the first time, I saw a flash of something that wasn't just calm. It was a deep, ancient sadness, mixed with a steely resolve. Generous? Yes, he was. But he was also just, and he was incredibly observant.
He saw who truly valued his contributions and who saw them as opportunities for personal gain. He saw who helped him build and who tried to siphon off the profits. She paused, her eyes sweeping over my mother, then landing back on Susan. He kept records, Mary, meticulous records, of every investment, every transaction, every discreet transfer of funds. She turned a page in the thick ledger that had reappeared on the table beside her, as if summoned by her will. The faint scent of old paper and ink filled the air. Here, she said, her finger tracing a line of dense numbers. Global Innovations Group, initial investment $500,000. Date, July 12, 2017. Subsequent liquidity event, meaning they sold their stake at a massive profit, April 5, 2019. Total return on investment, over $7 million for Robert's initial capital. She looked up, her eyes locked with Susan's. And then, a series of personal deposits into your account, Susan, spanning from August 2017 to May 2019, totaling almost exactly $2 million. Susan let out a whimper, a small, pathetic sound that seemed to drain the last vestiges of color from her face. She looked less like a sophisticated businesswoman and more like a child caught with her hand in the cookie jar, albeit a cookie jar filled with millions. That's a coincidence, Susan choked out, her voice barely a whisper. That's market timing. I was lucky. Lucky? Eleanor repeated, her voice gaining a fraction more volume, though still measured. Robert didn't believe in luck, Susan. He believed in effort, in strategy, and in loyalty. He believed that those who contributed to his success deserved a fair share, and he believed that those who tried to exploit his generosity, to steal from him, deserved to be held accountable. He saw that you leveraged his investment, used his research, and took a substantial cut for yourself without his explicit knowledge or consent. He documented it all. Every meeting, every phone call where you steered him towards that investment, every dollar that mysteriously appeared in your account. My mother finally snapped, her voice laced with a desperate fury. Eleanor, stop this. This is insane. Robert loved us all. He wouldn't turn against us. He didn't turn against you, Mary, Eleanor said.
her voice softening again, but with a weariness that suggested a long-held burden. He simply saw you all clearly. He saw the entitlement, the ambition, the casual disregard for his own sister's well-being. He saw that his daughters and his son-in-law were more interested in his wealth than in his intentions. He saw that your desire to manage my inheritance was just another thinly veiled attempt to gain control of assets you felt you deserved. She closed the ledger with a soft, decisive click. Robert's will wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate act of preservation.
He knew that the moment his assets were distributed according to tradition, they would be swallowed whole by the insatiable appetites of those who saw him as nothing more than a source of funds. He knew that the only way to ensure his legacy of giving, his commitment to helping others, would continue was to place it directly into the hands of someone who understood its true value. She looked at me, a subtle nod that acknowledged our shared understanding. Someone who had already been quietly nurturing that same spirit. The implication hung in the air, heavier than any accusation. My mother's eyes widened, her gaze flicking between Eleanor and me. The stunned silence in the room was now fractured by the dawning realization of a complete and utter power shift. They had spent the last few days circling Eleanor like starving wolves, confident in their presumption of her helplessness, their inherent right to her newfound fortune. Now, they saw her not as a victim of circumstance, but as a master strategist, armed with irrefutable evidence of their own avarice and deceit. You knew? My mother stammered, turning to me, her voice trembling. You knew about this? About Susan? And you said nothing? The humiliation they had so readily inflicted on Eleanor was now reflected in their own faces. Their condescension, their sneers, their thinly veiled contempt, all of it had been aimed at a woman who had spent years managing an independent fortune, who had quietly supported countless causes, and who had been systematically betrayed by her own family. And I, privy to the truth, had remained silent, letting them expose themselves, letting them dig their own graves. I knew Grandma Eleanor wasn't who you thought she was, I said, my voice clear and steady, devoid of the tremor that had plagued my mother's. I knew she had her own resources, her own plans. And I knew that you were all more interested in the idea of her inheritance than in understanding her. Aunt Carol finally spoke, her voice a low growl of disbelief and fury. So, this is your doing? You put her up to this? You fed her information? Eleanor shook her head slowly. Robert did. He trusted me. He saw that I had the discernment to manage these matters. He saw that I was not swayed by greed, but by purpose. He saw that I understood the difference between genuine need and selfish acquisition. She picked up a delicate porcelain teacup, her hand perfectly steady. He wanted to ensure that his philanthropic endeavors, the ones he poured so much of his life into, would continue. He wanted to see the EH Educational Trust flourish, and he wanted to ensure that the funds he'd discreetly channeled into various community projects over the years, the ones he was so proud of, would be protected from those who saw them only as a personal dividend. She took a sip of tea, her eyes never leaving my mother's. He even kept a separate file on Robert Jr.'s business ventures. Not to judge, but to understand the financial flow, he noticed certain irregularities, inconsistencies, and he made a note to investigate further should the need arise, a note that I have now, of course, honored. The mention of my brother, Robert Jr., brought a fresh wave of panic to my mother, her face contorted. Robert Jr.? What about Robert Jr.? He's my son. And he was Robert's son, too, Eleanor said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. And Robert was a businessman. He understood risk. He also understood due diligence. He noticed that certain investments made by Robert Jr.'s company, investments that seemed to have been made with a remarkably low personal capital investment from him, consistently yielded substantial returns that were then channeled into rather extravagant personal accounts and luxury purchases. He suspected and documented that some of those initial seed funds might have originated from other sources that were not entirely his to distribute. The confession they had been demanding from Eleanor had now turned into a stark, public unveiling of their own secrets. Susan, weeping openly now, buried her face in her hands. Aunt Carol looked as if she might physically combust. My mother stood frozen, her world collapsing around her, the carefully constructed edifice of their family's perceived success and moral superiority crumbling into dust. "So you're saying," my mother began, her voice barely audible,
That Robert suspected? Robert knew, Eleanor corrected gently. He confirmed it. He saw the pattern, and he was deeply disappointed. He wanted his son to be a shrewd businessman, not a sophisticated embezzler. He believed in ethical enterprise, and he believed that his own sister, who he had entrusted with the stewardship of his philanthropic vision, would be the one to uphold those values. She pushed the ledger slightly forward, its leather cover worn smooth with time, and I now realized, with the weight of undeniable truth. This ledger, she said, her voice resonating with the quiet authority of a judge delivering a verdict, is more than just Robert's accounting. It's a testament to his character. It's a record of his intent, and it's the foundation upon which I will continue his work. She looked directly at me, and for the first time I felt the full weight of her trust and the immense responsibility it entailed. It wasn't a triumphant look, but one of sober determination. The victory wasn't about gloating. It was about duty. The $10 million, Eleanor stated, her voice now carrying the resonance of her newfound power, is not an inheritance in the traditional sense. It's the capital infusion Robert designated to ensure the expansion and sustainability of the various initiatives we've been quietly supporting. The Educational Trust will now have the resources to fund scholarships for hundreds of nurses, not just a handful.
The Veterans Support Initiative will be able to provide comprehensive rehabilitation services. The Historical Preservation Society will have the means to save entire districts, not just single buildings. Robert wanted to leave a tangible, lasting impact. He didn't want his wealth to be squandered on superficial luxuries or to fuel further greed. He wanted it to be a force for good. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the shattered faces of her daughters and son-in-law. The silence was no longer tense. It was hollowed out, filled with the echoes of their own exposed indiscretions. The sheer magnitude of their misjudgment, their blindness, was palpable. They had seen a frail old woman, a charitable recipient, and had underestimated her profoundly. They had failed to see the quiet strength, the decades of experience, the deep well of integrity that Robert had always recognized. My decision, Eleanor continued, her voice unwavering, was to honor Robert's true wishes, to protect his legacy, and to ensure that his generosity would be used to uplift and empower, not to enrich those who had already proven themselves incapable of appreciating its true value. She looked at me again, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. And to ensure that my own niece, who has shown a similar understanding and a similar spirit, would be instrumental in carrying that vision forward. Robert believed in the power of planting seeds, and he saw in both of us fertile ground. The room felt suddenly too small, too suffocating. The opulence of the lake house, which had once symbolized family prosperity, now felt like a gilded cage of their own making. The air was thick with unspoken accusations and the bitter tang of regret. Susan was still weeping, her sobs now muffled by the silencer of her own shame. Aunt Carol sat rigid, her face a mask of cold fury, calculating her next move, her next avenue of attack, though I suspected even she knew the battle was lost. My mother stood utterly defeated, her dreams of entitlement, of vindication, of basking in inherited wealth reduced to ashes. Eleanor rose slowly, gracefully. She was not a conqueror standing triumphant on a battlefield, but a steward who had successfully protected a precious inheritance. The $10 million wasn't a prize she had won. It was a responsibility she had accepted, a mantle she had faithfully worn for years, now officially bestowed with the full weight of Robert's will. I will, of course, be seeking legal counsel to ensure that Robert's final wishes are executed precisely as he intended, Eleanor stated, her voice polite, businesslike, and utterly unyielding. There will be adjustments made to certain existing familial arrangements to reflect these intentions. I will naturally keep you informed of any relevant developments. She turned and walked towards the door, her steps measured, her posture erect. She didn't look back. She didn't need to.
The devastation she had wrought was etched onto their faces, a far more potent testament to her victory than any shouted declaration. As she reached the doorway, she paused for a fraction of a second, her gaze falling on me, a silent acknowledgement that passed between us, a shared understanding that transcended the immediate wreckage. Then she was gone, leaving the three of them in a tableau of utter ruin. I stood there for a moment, watching the space where she had been. The silence that remained was not empty, it was pregnant with consequence. The humiliation they had tried to inflict had been returned, amplified 1,000-fold. The hunger for money had blinded them to the deeper currents of loyalty, intellect, and quiet power. They had sought to control, to consume, and in their relentless pursuit, they had lost everything. The cinematic sweep of the scene ended not with a bang, but with the soft click of a closing door, the quiet finality of a chapter closed. The weight that had been pressing down on me, the anticipation, the dread, the simmering anger, it all began to dissipate, replaced by a profound sense of release, a quiet exhale that felt like the first breath of clean air after a storm. The game was over. The score had been settled, and the true inheritance, the one of integrity and purpose, had finally found its rightful custodian.